Hey, this is Mrs. Dellosso, and in this podcast, we are going to start talking about cells. Cytology is the study of cells. So, in this podcast, we're going to talk about some important scientists that observed some of the first cells using microscopes and also how it came to develop the cell theory. So, we'll talk about the three parts of the cell theory, and then we'll also talk about the levels of organization. So let's get started. So let's talk about some of the scientists that you need to know. The first scientist that you should know is the scientist Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke used a compound light microscope which only magnified about 30 times. And just to remind you, our microscopes in our classroom can magnify up to 400 times. So he studied cork, which is the dead cells of oak bark, and what he noticed under his microscope were these tiny boxes, tiny empty boxes, and he thought that these empty boxes resembled the cells of a monastery, and this is where the term cell came from. That came from Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke also wrote Micrographia, where he describes some of his observations. All right, so the next scientist is Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He was intrigued by Micrographia, which Robert Hooke wrote, and he was the first scientist to describe living organisms under a microscope. And here's an image of what Anton van Leeuwenhoek might have observed. So Hooke observed dead cells, Anton van Leeuwenhoek observed living cells. Next scientist is Robert Brown, and he described the nucleus as a special structure found in all cells. And at this point, the function of the nucleus was not known, but today we know that DNA is found inside the nucleus, and DNA is the nucleic acid that contains the genetic information that controls all cell activities. Matthias Schleiden stated that all plants are composed of cells. Theodor Schwann stated that all animals are composed of cells, and Rudolf Virchow stated that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So the observations of these scientists have been combined to form something called the cell theory. Continued research over the years by many scientists using more and more technically advanced instruments confirmed the validity of this theory, which is composed of three principles. So the first principle is that the cell is the basic unit of all living things. Now, all living organisms are made up of cells. That means even single-celled organisms made up of one cell. But even looking at this elephant and mouse, even though they are very, very different in size, their cells are still about the same size. The difference is this elephant is composed of many, many, many more cells than this mouse, but both organisms are composed of cells. Also, not all of an organism is made of cells. So those parts of an organism that are not composed of cells are made of materials that cells manufacture. So here in this diagram, so much of the material in our skeletons is not made of cells, but of cellular secretion, so what the cell actually produces. So number two, part of the cell theory, cells perform all the functions of living things. So don't worry about copying this diagram down. I will give you a copy of this. But here are some of the cellular functions and processes. So you have nutrition, such as absorption and digestion. You have some internal functions, such as synthesis, respiration, which we'll also talk about later on, movement, irritability, which is response. You have the release of materials, and also how the cell maintains its ability to survive. So that means maintaining homeostasis and also producing new cells. And third, all cells come from the reproduction of existing cells. So in order for new cells to be formed, they come from pre-existing cells. So cells reproduce by dividing. Cellular division results in a new organism if that organism is unicellular or one cell. It can also produce more cells in the same organism, or you can have cells that produce the sex cells like the egg and sperm. So these are the three parts of the cell theory. All right, so let's start talking about the levels of cellular organization. First, just want to refresh your memory on some terminology. When we have a single-celled organism, that single-celled organism is also known as a unicellular organism. You also have organisms like humans that are made of many cells and they're multicellular. Then you also have colonial organisms, which are groups of cells that live together, but if they were to separate, they would still actually be able to survive. And an example of that is called a volvox. So we have one cell, could be a single-celled organism, it's unicellular, but what about multicellular organisms? How are multicellular organisms organized? Well, we start with a single cell, and when we have groups of cells with a similar function, they form tissues. Groups of tissues that have the same function will form organs, and groups of organs that work together form an organ system, such as that in our bodies and also in some animals as well. So let's see how this applies in humans. So taking a look at diagram A, we have groups of cells that will form tissue or smooth muscle, and when we have groups of these tissues working together, the similar function, they're going to form in structure B called the stomach, and the stomach is part of the digestive system. So in A, we're seeing how cells work together forming tissues. In B, we're seeing how tissues form organs and how organs are part of an organ system. And then we have all of the organ systems that work together to help keep you alive. So that's the end of this video. I hope you found this helpful and bring any questions with you to class.